January 26th, 1942. 60 hours underwater. The Rzhev marshes, or what was once the Volchia River. Inside the steel cocoon, submerged to a depth of 7 meters, about 23 feet, time had ceased to exist. It had turned into a viscous, cold substance just like the icy water pressing on the tank's hull from the outside, the air inside. It could no longer be called air. It was a heavy, oily mixture of exhaled breaths, the stench of sweat, fear, diesel, and something else, faintly sweet, hinting at decay. It was thick as gruel, and each breath was a struggle, as if you were trying to breathe through a wet rag. Lieutenant Sergei Orlov, the 20-year-old crew commander, sat in his seat, pressed against the cold armor of the turret. His eyes, long accustomed to the absolute darkness, were wide open but saw nothing but his own phantoms. He did not move. Movement was an expenditure of precious oxygen. He listened. He listened to the breathing of his 3 subordinates, the intermittent, ragged inhale and exhale of the gunner, Misha Sokolov, who was already barely conscious. The heavy, gurgling wheeze of the driver, Ivan Zubov, locked in his driver's compartment, separated from them by a bulkhead, and the quiet, almost inaudible breathing of Kostya Belov, the loader, who was curled up in a ball on the ammunition rack. Orlov had established a law, a cruel, inhuman, but only possible law for their sinking world. Breathing shifts. For 5 minutes, one man would breathe slowly and deeply. The others would breathe superficially in tiny sips, at the very limit of their capacity, almost not breathing at all. Then the shift would change. It was now Orlov's shift. He slowly drew the poison slurry into his lungs, and it burned him from the inside with carbon dioxide. His head spun, crimson spots danced before his eyes. He counted the seconds by the beats of his own heart. The heart beat slowly, sluggishly, as if it too lacked strength. 300 beats. His shift was over. He held his breath, and quietly, almost silently, tapped his knuckle on the breech of the gun. The signal. A faint cough came from Belov in the darkness. He understood. It was his turn now. Orlov closed his eyes and sank into a state resembling a lethargic sleep. He had learned to do this over the last 2 days, to switch off thoughts, desires, memories, anything that required energy, anything that consumed oxygen. He had become a mechanism, a part of this dying tank. His task was to maintain the operation of the other mechanisms until the last one failed. But through this icy self-control, a question broke through. One he had been pushing away for 60 hours. A question more terrifying than the cold and the suffocation. How had they come to this? How had the crew of a brand new T-34, the pride of the Red Army, devolved into a primitive tribe, waging war for a single gulp of air on the bottom of a frozen river? An image flashed in his mind. Blinding sun, the crunch of snow, the smell of pine and smoke, and he, a young lieutenant full of hope, giving the order that would be the beginning of the end for them all. But to understand how this 20-year-old boy in an officer's tunic had turned into the ruthless dictator of an underwater world, we must go back 72 hours, to that frosty and clear January day, when their world had not yet sunk beneath the ice. January 24th, 1942. A snow-covered pine forest somewhere near Rzhev. The air was so frosty it seemed to ring. The trees stood in heavy caps of snow, and the silence was broken only by the distant, muffled rumble of artillery, which everyone had long since grown accustomed to, like the beating of their own hearts. By a T-34 tank camouflaged with fir branches, its crew was gathered. 4 of them, an entire world enclosed in a steel box. The commander, Lieutenant Sergei Orlov, just 20 years old. A graduate of an accelerated course, not yet blooded in combat, but with burning eyes and a firm belief in the regulations and in victory. He tried to appear strict and confident, adjusting the belt on his greatcoat, which was stiff from the cold, but a boyish uncertainty hid in the corners of his mouth. He was reading a letter from the political officer to the crew, full of slogans and calls to action, but his thoughts were far away. He was thinking of his mother in besieged Leningrad, from whom there had been no news for 3 months. Nearby, leaning against the armor, warm from the running engine, sat the driver-mechanic, Starshina Ivan Zubov, the oldest of them, already over 40, a sullen, taciturn man from near Vologda who had worked as a tractor driver on a collective farm before the war. For him, war was not about posters and slogans, but hard, dirty work that needed to be done so he could return home to his wife and 3 children. He was cleaning his Nagin revolver with a piece of oily cloth, and his calloused, chapped hands did it with a familiar, unhurried thoroughness. He disliked the young lieutenant, considering him green, but he carried out orders without question. The gunner, Yefreitor Misha Sokolov, was the youngest. He had barely turned 18, a rosy-cheeked, blue-eyed boy from a Siberian village who still blushed when he heard a strong word. He was sitting on an ammunition crate, writing a letter to his school sweetheart. His frozen fingers struggled to hold the indelible pencil. He breathed on them for warmth. There was not a word about the war in his letter, only about the first snow, about how much he missed her braids and promises to return with victory. He still believed that nothing could happen to him. And finally, the 4th, the loader and radio operator, Private Konstantin Belov, Kostya, a quiet, inconspicuous young man in thick-lensed glasses, a former physics and mathematics student at Leningrad University. He didn't fit into this military picture. Instead of cleaning his weapon or writing letters, he was reading a tattered textbook on inorganic chemistry, which he carried with him in his duffel bag like a talisman. His comrades teased him, calling him the professor, but it was good-natured. He spoke little, preferring to observe and think. He saw the world not as a collection of people and events, but as a complex system governed by the laws of physics and chemistry. Even the war, for him, was merely a chain of chemical reactions and vectors of applied force. That day, they had something of a lull. They received mail, a new batch of shells, and even some captured chocolate. Zubov grumbled that they should have sent lard instead. Sokolov carefully broke off half of his share to send to his mother in a parcel. Orlov ate his portion quickly, barely tasting it, thinking about the upcoming offensive. Belov, however, slowly savored his square, analyzing its composition and caloric content. In the evening, when the frost grew even sharper, they gathered in a nearby dugout. A small potbelly stove cast flickering reflections on their faces. They drank hot, weak tea and dreamed. Zubov dreamed of a banya and of returning home for the haymaking season. Sokolov, of taking that same girl to the cinema to see Volga Volga. Orlov dreamed of Berlin and of being met as a hero in a liberated Leningrad. Only Belov was silent, staring at the fire. He didn't dream. He knew the statistics. He knew the average life expectancy of a tank and its crew in the RZHEV MEATGRINDER. And that knowledge left no room for dreams. Late that night, when everyone but the sentry was asleep, a messenger from headquarters woke Orlov. An order. Tomorrow, at dawn, their battalion was to force a crossing of the Volchya River over the ice and break through the German defenses on the other side. A breakthrough. The word sounded proud and hopeful. But Orlov looked at the map. The river made a bend at that point, and they would be under crossfire from 3 sides. And the ice. Reconnaissance had reported that the ice was strong, that it would hold. But something inside the lieutenant tightened with a bad premonition. He left the dugout. The night sky was clear, studded with cold, sharp stars. The frost crunched under his Valenki boots. He walked over to his tank, his 34. He placed a gloved palm on the ice-cold armor. The machine seemed like a living, sleeping beast. His fortress, his hope, his weapon. He did not yet know that in a few hours, this beast would become their common grave. That evening, for the last time in his life, he looked at the stars. The dawn of January 25th was blood red, as if the sky itself was foretelling what was about to happen. The cold was so intense that the iron burned even through mittens. The tank's diesel engine started with difficulty, with wheezing and coughing, spewing clouds of grey smoke into the frosty air. Orlov's crew was already inside their machine. The cramped space, reeking of diesel and powder fumes, had become their second home. Zubov, grunting, sat in his seat, warming up the engine. Sokolov was wiping the lenses of the gun sight with a cloth, humming some simple tune under his breath. Belov was checking the radio, which, as usual, was working with terrible static. Orlov looked through the triplex periscope at the white, blinding plain. Ahead, about 700 meters, roughly 765 yards away, lay the frozen Volchaya River, wide, flat as a table. The perfect place for an attack. The perfect place for a massacre. The command came over the radio, sharp as a gunshot. "Forward! For the motherland!" Zubov ground the levers, and the 30-ton machine, shuddering with its entire hull, moved from its spot. It had begun. The first minutes of an attack are always the most terrifying. The waiting for the first hit. The tanks of their battalion emerged from the woods and rolled across the snowy field towards the river. Immediately, German guns from the other bank opened up. Shells began to explode all around, throwing up black fountains of frozen earth and snow. Shrapnel drummed against the armor like hail. "Bear right, Zubov! Towards that grove! Speed! Speed!" Orlov yelled, trying to shout over the din. Sokolov, glued to the sight, was looking for targets. "I see a machine gun nest! By the dry tree! Range 600! High explosive!" he reported. "Fire!" Orlov commanded. A shot thundered. The turret filled with acrid smoke. Belov, working quickly and precisely like a machine, was already loading the next shell. The tank shot out onto the river ice. It creaked under the tracks, but the ice held. They were leading the charge. The other machines followed. And then, what Orlov had feared most happened. The Germans had found their range. One of the shells hit the tank to their right. A flash, a roar, and where a T-34 had been, a huge torch now burned. "Faster, Zubov! Faster!" Orlov rasped. And at that moment, their machine was violently shaken. The impact wasn't to the turret, but somewhere below, in the running gear. The tank jerked, veering to the side. "The track! They've knocked out the left one!" Zubov roared. The machine became uncontrollable. It continued to move by inertia, but it spun like a top. Directly ahead was a steep, icy slope down to the water, where the ice was thinnest. "Brake!" Orlov screamed. But it was too late. The uncontrollable steel box slid off the main ice sheet, and with a deafening crack like the crunch of gigantic bones, it broke through the ice. The last thing Orlov saw in the triplex was the gray, indifferent sky, which abruptly shot upwards. The tank tilted, and in the next second it was swallowed by the icy black water. There was a deafening screech of metal. Torrents of water flooded the fighting compartment through every crack. The light bulb flickered and went out. Absolute, impenetrable darkness fell. The machine was sinking, slowly, but inexorably. There were screams, gurgling, the sound of water flooding the red-hot engine somewhere in the back. The water was glacial. It instantly soaked their clothes, paralyzing the will. Orlov felt the tank hit something hard and stop. They were at the bottom. The water continued to rise. It was already up to their waists. "The hatches! Open the hatches!" someone screamed in panic. It was Sokolov. Orlov fumbled his way to his commander's hatch and tried to open it. Useless. The water pressure outside was colossal. He heard Belov trying to open the loader's hatch. The same result. And then came Zubov's cry from the driver's compartment. "Help! I'm pinned!" The water in the fighting compartment had already risen to their chests. The cold seized their bodies, breathing became harder and harder. This was the end. To drown in your own tank, like rats in a trap. But then something strange happened. The water level stopped rising. It froze at neck level. Something in the engine compartment behind them cracked loudly, and the inflow of water ceased. An air pocket. The engine compartment was completely flooded, but the fighting compartment, proving to be sealed, had retained a pocket of air. They were alive, but they were trapped. In a steel coffin at the bottom of an icy river under enemy fire, in complete darkness in freezing water with almost no air. Orlov heard Sokolov crying, the quiet, pathetic weeping of an 18-year-old boy in the absolute silence of the underwater world was more terrifying than any explosion. And in that moment, Lieutenant Orlov understood. Panic would kill them faster than the lack of air. He took a deep breath of icy water and air and screamed as he had never screamed in his life. Silence. Everyone, be silent. The scream broke into a cough, but it had an effect. The crying stopped. In the ensuing silence, only their ragged breathing and the quiet, monotonous drip of water from somewhere above could be heard. In that moment, he realized, if they were to survive, he had to become more than just their commander. He would have to become their jailer, their law, and their god. The first hours in underwater captivity were like an endless nightmare. The absolute, impenetrable darkness pressed down on the mind, blurring the lines between reality and delirium. The cold was not just a sensation, it became the very essence of their existence. The icy water in which they stood chest deep drew out the last remnants of warmth from their bodies. Their teeth chattered uncontrollably, their bodies were racked with cramps. Every movement sent a dull ache through their frozen muscles. The sounds had changed. Instead of the familiar roar of battle, they were surrounded by a world of muffled, distorted noises. A hollow gurgling, the creak of metal under water pressure, and most of all, the deafening thud of their own hearts in their ears, and the constant, maddening drip of drops. Drip, drip, drip. It felt as if it wasn't water dripping, but time itself counting down the final seconds of their lives. The panic, suppressed by Orlov's scream, had not disappeared. It lay in wait, transformed into a quiet, animalistic terror. Sokolov was the first to break. He started sobbing again, then his sobs turned into hysterics. "We're all going to die. We're going to drown. Let me out of here!" he shouted, pounding his fists on the cold armor. Orlov, fighting through the pain in his numb legs, reached him in the dark and shook him hard. "Get a grip, you freighter," he hissed in his face. "Your screaming is wasting our air." "What air, Comrade Lieutenant? There's almost none left. We're going to suffocate." Sokolov persisted. "We won't suffocate if we stay quiet and still," Orlov replied firmly, though he didn't believe it himself. He managed to calm Sokolov, but then Zubov's hoarse voice came from the driver's compartment. "Lieutenant, I'm pinned. My leg. By the lever. I can't get it out. The water's rising." It took Orlov and Belov an incredible effort to reach the driver in the total darkness and freezing water. The passage was narrow, cluttered with some boxes. When they finally squeezed through to him, the scene was horrific. Zubov was indeed pinned by a mangled control lever. The water in his compartment was slightly higher than in the fighting compartment and continued to seep slowly through a damaged periscope. "Pull," he groaned. They pulled, but it was all in vain. The metal held him in a death grip. "We need to pry it." "A crowbar," Belov whispered. They had no crowbar, but they had an entrenching tool. Belov, who had a phenomenal memory for the location of every object in the tank, found a small pry bar by touch and handed it to Orlov. What followed was hell. For almost an hour, standing chest deep in water, they tried to bend the damn lever. Their hands wouldn't obey. Their fingers slipped on the icy metal. Zubov would lose consciousness from pain and cold, then come to and start swearing wildly. Finally, with a deafening screech, the lever gave way. They pulled the unconscious Zubov into the fighting compartment. His leg was clearly broken. Somehow, using bandages from the first aid kit and pieces of some plank, they fashioned a splint for him. This exhausting work completely drained their strength, but it also united them. The panic receded, replaced by a grim determination. Orlov conducted the first inventory. What did they have? A supply of air in the fighting compartment with a volume of about 10 cubic meters. 4 men, 1 wounded. a few pieces of hardtack in a rubberized pouch that Belov had managed to stuff into his tunic, a flask of water, half frozen, a flare gun with 3 flares completely useless underwater, and most importantly, they didn't know where they were, how far from the shore, and whose shore was it, theirs or the Germans. They tried knocking on the armor, tapping out the SOS signal in Morse code, but the only response was the crushing silence of the water's depths. Hours passed. They stopped feeling the cold. This was a bad sign. Their bodies had simply stopped fighting, surrendering their heat to the environment. Their consciousness began to cloud over. Orlov knew they had to do something. "Everyone, take off your greatcoats and jackets," he commanded. "Why?" "We'll freeze completely." Zubov, who had regained consciousness, objected. "Wet clothes only steal heat. We need to wring them out and put them on again, and huddle together. We'll warm each other," Orlov explained. It was torture. Taking off the icy, heavy clothes, wringing them out with numb hands, and then putting them back on their blue-tinged bodies. But they did it. They huddled into a tight group around the breech of the gun, pressing against each other. 4 trembling bodies in a steel tomb. And then Belov, the professor, said what they were all thinking but were afraid to say aloud. "Comrade Lieutenant." His voice was quiet but clear. "The problem isn't oxygen. We have enough of that for a long time. The problem is carbon dioxide. We exhale it, and its concentration is rising. Soon, we'll start losing consciousness, not from suffocation, but from poisoning." A silence fell. Everyone understood he was right. They wouldn't suffocate. They would simply fall asleep and never wake up. It seemed it was all over. There was no hope. But it was then that the quiet, bespectacled student uttered words that were both salvation and madness. "Comrade Lieutenant, what do we have in the fire extinguishers?" Belov's question hung in the thick, heavy air of the steel crypt. "What fire extinguishers, Kostya? Are you out of your mind?" "We're drowning, not burning," Zubov rasped, wincing from the pain in his broken leg. But Orlov was silent. He knew Belov never spoke just for the sake of it. Strange, unexpected ideas were always forming in his mind. "Tetrachloride. 2 cylinders under the commander's seat," the lieutenant replied, straining his memory. "No, not those," Belov said, shaking his head in the darkness. "I mean the handheld ones. The fire suppression cartridges with potassium hydroxide. They should be in the stowage rack." A frantic, desperate search began. In complete darkness, by touch, they started looking for these cartridges. Their hands, numb to the cold, groped along the smooth armor, slippery with condensation, bumping into sharp corners and protrusions. Sokolov, fighting off his weakness, helped them. Even Zubov, forgetting his pain, gave advice on where the rack might be. Finally, Belov let out a triumphant cry. He had found it. A small metal box bolted to the turret wall. With trembling hands, they pried it open. Inside, neatly arranged, lay 3 cylindrical cartridges. "What is this? And what are we going to do with them?" Sokolov asked. And then Belov began to explain. His voice in the darkness sounded like a professor giving a lecture in an empty auditorium. He spoke of chemical reactions, of the absorption of carbon dioxide by alkali. He explained that if they opened these cartridges and spread their contents on a surface, the potassium hydroxide would begin to react with the carbon dioxide in the air, turning it into harmless potassium carbonate. In essence, they could create a primitive chemical scrubber just like on a submarine. Zubov listened to him with disbelief. "Chemistry," he grumbled. "Don't you pull our leg, Kostya? How can some powder save us from death?" But Orlov listened intently. Belov's idea seemed insane, but it had its own iron logic. It was a chance. The only one, and possibly the last. "Do as you say," he told Belov firmly. Opening the cartridges proved difficult. They had no tools. They had to use a bayonet. Belov, like a surgeon, carefully in the dark, cut through the metal casing of the first cartridge. A white powder spilled out. It was damp and warm to the touch. "Where to put it?" he asked. They needed a large surface area. Orlov, without hesitation, tore off his tunic. "Here, spread it on this." They laid the wet tunic over the gun's breech and carefully spread the white powder on it. Then, they opened the second and third cartridges. Now all that was left was to wait and hope that the nerdy student was right. An hour passed, then another. At first, nothing happened. The air remained just as heavy and suffocating. Zubov was already starting to mutter that it was all for nothing. But then Orlov noticed, or rather, felt it. It became a tiny bit easier to breathe. Just a little, on the verge of perception. The nausea disappeared. His head felt less heavy. "It's working," he whispered. It was their first victory. A small, almost imperceptible victory over certain death. They had defeated the carbon dioxide. They had bought themselves a few more hours of life. This success breathed new hope into them. For the first time in many hours, they felt not just raw animal fear, but exhilaration. They realized their fate was not sealed, that they could fight back. Belov was transformed overnight from the eccentric professor into their chief savior. Even Zubov looked at him, as much as was possible in the dark, with a certain respect. "You've got a head on your shoulders, Kostya," he rumbled. "You belong in headquarters, not hauling shells." But their joy was short-lived. They had solved one problem, but others remained. The cold, hunger, and the most terrifying thing, the uncertainty. It was at that moment, when they allowed themselves a minute of weakness and hope, that they heard it. The sound came from above. A dull, rhythmic thud transmitted through the mass of water in the tank's armor. Thump, 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 thump. Someone was walking on the ice directly above their heads. Friendlies or Germans? The question made them freeze. Hold the very breath they had fought so hard to reclaim. Their small victory had attracted the attention of someone from the outside world, and they didn't know if that someone brought salvation or final doom. The small victory over suffocation gave them not only air, but something more important, structure. Orlov understood that without strict discipline and a clear routine, they would quickly descend into madness and anarchy. He gathered the last of his willpower and turned their sunken tank into something akin to a monastery or a submarine, living by strict laws. He announced the creation of their own small empire at the bottom of the Volchya River. "From this moment on, we live on a schedule," he announced in a firm voice that brooked no argument. "What schedule, Lieutenant? You can't see day or night in here," grumbled Zubov. "I have a watch. It's still running," Orlov replied, touching the commander's watch on his wrist. "It will be our son." And he established the laws. The first and most important law: conserve air. He introduced those same breathing shifts we mentioned at the beginning. Every 2 hours, one person had the right to breathe relatively freely. The other 3 had to control every breath, making it shallow and infrequent. It was incredibly difficult, but it worked. The second law: conserve energy, a minimum of movement. Talking was allowed only in a whisper and only when necessary. Most of the time, they were to remain in a state close to suspended animation, trying not to think or feel. The third law: rationing. They had only 4 pieces of hardtack left. Orlov divided them into 8 portions. Each man was allotted 1/4 of a piece of hardtack per day. It was a few crumbs, but it was food. They took water directly from the tank, filtering it through a piece of cloth. It tasted of oil and rust, but it was water. He even organized watches. Each man, in turn, had to stay awake and listen to what was happening outside, to tap out SOS signals in Morse code, and to monitor their homemade carbon dioxide scrubber, periodically stirring the powder on the tunic so it would react better with the air. At first, it seemed absurd, playing at discipline in a mass grave. But gradually, everyone understood the genius of Orlov's plan. This harsh, almost prison-like regime not only gave them a chance at physical survival, it gave them a purpose. It prevented their minds from dissolving into the darkness and despair. They weren't just waiting for death. They were working, they were fighting. Their tank was no longer just a prison. It became their Noah's Ark, their small state with its own laws, hierarchy, and even an economy based on gulps of air and crumbs of bread. Orlov was their ruler, strict but fair. Belov was their minister of science, responsible for the life support system. Sokolov and Zubov were the ordinary citizens of this underwater republic. They learned to live in the dark. Their hearing sharpened to its absolute limit. They could hear the hull creak under the water pressure, the silt shifting on the bottom, the air bubbles seeping through micro cracks and rising to the surface. They learned to communicate almost without words, understanding each other by their breathing, by the slightest movement. They fell into a state of a strange, grim trance. Time stretched on endlessly. The first day passed, then the second. Their bodies grew accustomed to the cold and hunger, but their souls were tormented by ghosts. In the long hours of silence and semi-consciousness, each was visited by his own demons. Zubov in his delirium spoke to his wife, promising her he would be home soon. Sokolov cried in his sleep, calling for his mother. Belov muttered chemical formulas as if chanting spells. And Orlov replayed the moment of the attack in his head again and again. He blamed himself. He, the commander, had doomed his crew. This thought was sharper than any shrapnel, but he had no right to show his weakness. He was their rock, their steel core. If he broke, they would all break, and their system worked. They were alive. Their small, desperate empire held on. But, as in any empire, discontent was brewing. Not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of this new world. Zubov, tormented by the pain in his leg and by hunger, began to look, as much as was possible in the dark, towards Orlov more and more often. Hints of irritation and hatred could be heard in his breathing. He considered the lieutenant's laws meaningless and cruel. He believed Orlov was just delaying the inevitable, prolonging their suffering. In the darkness of their small world, a rebellion was taking root. On the third day of their underwater confinement, the fragile balance established by Orlov began to shatter. The source of the chaos was Ivan Zubov. The pain in his broken leg, the constant cold, and the hunger had turned the sullen but disciplined soldier into an embittered, desperate animal. He became the embodiment of the fear and selfishness that lurked in each of their souls. He was the voice of their despair. It all started with small things. Zubov began to break the laws of their little empire. He started breathing more loudly when it wasn't his shift. He began to move around more often, complaining of pain, though everyone understood it was just an excuse. He started to sow doubts. "Lieutenant, are you sure your watch is right?" he rasped one time. "Maybe a week has passed. Maybe no one is looking for us anymore." "The watch is right. They are looking for us," Orlov answered curtly. "And what if they aren't? What if we've been written off? Counted as dead? We're sitting here, breathing on a schedule like fools, and they've already sent death notices for us." Zubov persisted. His words were poison. They seeped into the mind of Sokolov, who was already on the verge of a breakdown. He started crying quietly again. Orlov tried to put a stop to these conversations, but Zubov grew more brazen. He threw down a direct challenge to the commander's authority. The climax came during the next distribution of rations, a few crumbs of hardtack. Orlov, as usual, divided the last piece of hardtack into 4 equal parts by feel. He passed a portion to Sokolov, then to Belov. When he held out a portion to Zubov, the man snatched not only his own share, but also the one intended for Orlov. "Enough!" he snarled. "You, Lieutenant, are sitting here warm and healthy while I'm wounded!" "I need more strength." In the ensuing silence, they could hear Zubov greedily, crunching, devouring the stolen crumbs. This was more than stealing food. This was rebellion. This was a declaration of war. Orlov knew that if he didn't react now, his authority would crumble and they would all perish in the chaos. He didn't say a word. In the complete darkness, he crawled towards Zubov. Sensing danger, Zubov tried to push him away, but Orlov was faster. He didn't hit him. He did something far more cruel. He grabbed Zubov by the throat and began to squeeze, depriving him of the very air they were fighting so hard to conserve. Zubov choked, started to fight back, but the odds were against him. Orlov, the 20-year-old boy, had become a merciless executioner. "You want to breathe?" he hissed directly into Zubov's ear. "You want to eat? You will eat and breathe only when I allow it. If you disobey an order one more time, I will simply strangle you. And the three of us will have more air. Do you understand?" He relaxed his grip. Zubov greedily gulped for air, coughing and sobbing. He was broken. Not physically, but morally. He understood that this Green Lieutenant was prepared to do anything to maintain order. Even to kill. This was the surgical cruelty that military psychologists speak of. Orlov was not a sadist. He was a surgeon, amputating a gangrenous limb to save the whole organism. But this act cost him dearly. He felt something inside him die. He had crossed a line. He had stained his hands with filth so that the others might have a chance to keep theirs clean. Silence reigned in the tank once more, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of despair, but the silence of fear and submission. The rebellion was crushed. Orlov's power became absolute. He had defended his law. He had saved their little empire from anarchy. But while they were dealing with their internal conflict, while they waged their small civil war over crumbs of bread and gulps of air, they did not hear how their real enemy, the outside environment, was preparing its final crushing blow. When the exhausted Zubov fell silent and Sokolov stopped crying, they all heard that sound again. The sound from above. But now it wasn't just footsteps. It was blows. Muffled but powerful blows on the ice. Someone was trying to break through the ice with picks or crowbars. Directly above them. Salvation. Or... The blows on the ice grew clearer. Someone was methodically, with German pedantry, cutting holes in the ice directly above them. The crew froze. Hope and terror warred in their souls. If it was their own men, it was salvation. If it was the Germans, it was the end. They could simply drop a grenade into the hole, and the hydraulic shock would turn their tank into a mass grave. They lay still, afraid to move. Each blow echoed in their hearts. Suddenly the blows stopped. A ringing silence fell. And then they heard a new sound. A scraping. Someone was lowering something into the water. "What is that?" Sokolov whispered. "Quiet!" Orlov cut him off. The scraping grew closer. It was no longer coming from above, but from the side. Something metallic was scraping against the armor of their tank. These were not rescuers. Rescuers would not behave this way. It was the Germans, most likely combat engineers. They were inspecting the sunken tank, perhaps to blow it up later, or to salvage it. In that moment, Orlov understood. Their passive waiting, their survival system, their little empire. It was all meaningless. They had been discovered. And now, their fate was in the hands of the enemy. This was the moment of cracked armor. The moment it became clear that there would be no rescue. That they needed to do something active, daring, suicidal. Thoughts raced through Orlov's mind. What could they do? Try to get out? Impossible. Signal them? They would hear and destroy them. Surrender? They simply wouldn't believe anyone was alive inside. And then, in his desperate mind, an insane, fantastical idea was born. An idea born on the razor's edge between life and death. He crawled over to Belov. "Kostya," he whispered, "if we fire the cannon, underwater, what will happen?" Belov froze for a moment. As always, he did not give in to panic, but began to think. His brain, exhausted by hunger and hypoxia, started working like a calculating machine. "A hydraulic shock," he whispered back. "Immense pressure. Water doesn't compress. The energy of the shot will go not forward, but in all directions. It could just crush us, or the hull might not hold and we'll be flooded instantly. And the ice? Orlov pressed. Could the shot break the ice above us? Belov thought again. Theoretically, yes. If the ice isn't too thick, the shockwave could shatter it. But what? Orlov hurried him. But the chance that we'll survive it approaches zero. It's suicide, Comrade Lieutenant. Orlov was silent. Suicide. But to stay and wait for the Germans to drop a grenade on them was also suicide, just a slow and humiliating one. And here, there was a chance. 1 in 1,000. But it was there. This was their weapon from the ashes. To turn the tank, their prison and their tomb, into a final weapon, an instrument of salvation. To use the cannon not to destroy the enemy, but to break through to their own world. "We're going to fire," Orlov said firmly. Zubov, hearing this, sat up. "Have you gone mad, Lieutenant? He said it would crush us. I don't want to die." "And I do," Orlov retorted sharply. "But it's better we die trying to do something than wait like cattle at a slaughterhouse." Sokolov. To the sight. Belov. Armor-piercing. The last, most terrifying preparation of their lives began. Working in the dark and water was almost impossible. Sokolov, his whole body trembling, tried to elevate the gun vertically. It was incredibly difficult. The mechanisms, unlubricated and rusted, yielded with great effort. Belov and Orlov together, straining their last reserves of strength, tried to ram the heavy 76mm armor-piercing shell into the breach. It was slippery, heavy. It kept slipping from their weakened hands. Zubov sat to the side and prayed. He didn't believe in success. He was simply waiting for the end. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, everything was ready. The gun was pointed straight up. The shell was in the chamber. Orlov placed a hand on Sokolov's shoulder. "Ready, Misha?" The boy only nodded, unable to utter a word. "Belov, Zubov, open your mouths and cover your ears, so your eardrums don't burst," Orlov commanded. He looked around, as much as was possible, at his men, his crew, exhausted, half dead, but not broken. "Well, with God's help," he whispered, and he gave the final order in his underwater empire. "Fire!" Misha Sokolov, the 18-year-old gunner, placed his fingers on the trigger. In that moment, his entire short life flashed before his eyes. He remembered his mother, her warm hands, the girl with the braids to whom he never sent that last letter. He closed his eyes and pressed. There was no explosion. There was something else, indescribable. A moment of absolute silence was replaced by a sensation as if the entire world had been compressed into a single point, and then had detonated. It was not a sound, but a monstrous, all-pervading pressure. A hydraulic shock. It slammed them against the armor, knocking the last bit of air from their lungs. It felt as if their bones would turn to dust. The tank shuddered as if struck by a gigantic hammer. New torrents of icy water gushed from the ceiling and walls. Rivets shot out like bullets. There was a deafening screech of tearing metal. Their ark, their fortress, their prison was dying. Orlov lost consciousness for a moment. When he came to, he didn't immediately understand what had happened. An infernal roar surrounded him. Water was flooding in with incredible speed. It was already up to his neck. He realized they had seconds left before being completely submerged. The end. Their insane plan hadn't worked. They had lost. But then he saw it. From above, through the murky water, a faint, ghostly beam of light was breaking through. Pale, gray, but it was light. Daylight. They had done it. They had broken the ice. "Up! Everyone up!" he screamed, choking on water. He tried to rouse Belov. The man was unconscious but breathing. Orlov shook him, slapped his cheeks. Kostya opened his eyes, looking around uncomprehendingly. "You're alive. Get to the hatch!" Orlov yelled. He crawled towards Sokolov. Misha was lying slumped in his seat. His eyes were open, but there was no life in them. A thin trickle of blood flowed from his mouth and ears. The young heart had not withstood the monstrous pressure. He was dead. The price of their salvation. Orlov froze for a second, looking at the dead face of the boy who had dreamed of the cinema. But he had no time for grief. The water was already up to his chin. He crawled to Zubov. The driver was unconscious, his head lolling in the rising water. Orlov checked his pulse. Faint, but there. He couldn't pull him out alone. "Belov! Help!" he shouted. The two of them tried to drag Zubov's heavy body towards the gunner's hatch, above which a hole now gaped in the icy shell. But they had no strength. They could barely stand themselves. "We can't do it!" Belov rasped. "Go alone," Orlov commanded. "Get out and call for help!" Belov, swaying, scrambled onto the gunner's seat and disappeared through the hole. Orlov was left alone, with two comrades, one dead, the other unconscious. The water had risen so high he had to tilt his head back to get a gulp of air. He knew this was the end. He had saved Belov, but he himself would die here. He closed his eyes, preparing for death. And at that moment, shouts came from above. Then a face in an Ushanka hat peered into the hole. "Hey! Anyone alive down there?" a voice shouted. It was their own men, scouts. They had been drawn by the roar of the shot and the fountain of water that had erupted from under the ice. They were pulled out from just under the ceiling of the flooded tank, Orlov and the unconscious Zubov. They couldn't retrieve Sokolov's body. He remained there, in his steel grave. When Orlov found himself on the ice, in the blinding sun, he couldn't believe his eyes. He was breathing clean, frosty air. He was alive. He and Belov, wrapped in sheepskin coats, were placed on a sled and taken to the medical battalion. On the way, a reconnaissance officer asked him, "How did you end up in there, Lieutenant? What happened?" And Orlov began to tell his story, about how they sank, about the 3 days in darkness, about the chemical scrubber, about the shot from the cannon. The officer listened to him intently, then shook his head sympathetically and said to the medic, "Give him a sedative. It looks like severe shell shock. He's talking nonsense." In that moment, Orlov understood. No one, ever, would believe their story. Their feat, their hell, their 3-day struggle for life sounded like the ravings of a madman. Salvation had turned into a new prison, a prison of disbelief and oblivion. The fates of the surviving crew members unfolded as the fates of people who have experienced something beyond human comprehension usually do. They were scattered among different hospitals and then to different fronts, as if the war machine sought to rid itself as quickly as possible of the inconvenient witnesses to a miracle that didn't fit into any regulations. Lieutenant Sergei Orlov, the commander who became the dictator of an underwater world, spent a long time recovering from bilateral pneumonia and severe frostbite. In the hospital, he was interrogated several times by an officer from the special department. Again and again, with manic precision, Orlov told his story about the breathing shifts, the potassium hydroxide, the underwater shot. The special officer listened, nodded, wrote something in his notebook, and then wrote in his conclusion. As a result of severe shell shock and oxygen deprivation, Lieutenant S.A. Orlov exhibits partial memory loss and a tendency towards fabrication. He wasn't punished. He was simply written off. The loss of the combat vehicle was deemed an accident. After the hospital, he was sent not to the front but to a rear training regiment as an instructor. He taught young tankers how to shoot and drive. He was a good instructor, but always silent and withdrawn. The soldiers were a little afraid of him. They said he had a heavy gaze. He went through the whole war but was never in combat again. After the victory, he returned to his native, ruined Leningrad. He learned that his mother had died of starvation during the first winter of the siege. He got a job at a factory, got married, had children. But the war never let him go. Every night he had the same dream. He was in the dark, in icy water, and he couldn't get enough air. He lived a long but quiet, unremarkable life. He died in the early 80s from a heart attack. No one, not even his own children, ever found out what hell he had gone through in January of 42. He took his secret to the grave. Konstantin Belov, the professor, the genius who saved the crew with his knowledge, also survived. His account, unlike Orlov's, was more restrained and resembled a scientific report. But he wasn't believed either. A doctor at the hospital diagnosed him with acute psychic trauma due to hypothermia. After treatment, as a man with higher education, he was transferred to a military laboratory where he worked on developing new types of smoke mixtures until the end of the war. His talent found an application, but his feat remained unrecognized. After the war, he returned to science, became a doctor of chemical sciences, a professor. He never told anyone what had happened at the bottom of the Volchya River. Perhaps he himself wanted to forget that nightmare, to erase it from his memory as an illogical and irrational event that defied scientific explanation. The fate of Starshina Ivan Zubov, the rebel, was the most tragic. He was pulled from the tank unconscious. In the hospital, in addition to the fracture, he was diagnosed with a severe form of pneumonia and gangrene in his frostbitten leg. The leg had to be amputated. He hovered between life and death for a long time. When he regained consciousness, he remembered nothing of the last days in the tank. His memory had blocked the traumatic recollections. He was medically discharged due to his wound and returned to his village near Vologda as an invalid. He never knew for the rest of his life how he had managed to survive. He thought he had simply been pulled from the flooded tank right after it fell through the ice. He lived out the rest of his life working as an accountant on the collective farm, and only sometimes in his dreams, vague images would come to him. Darkness, cold, and a young lieutenant strangling him. He would wake up in a cold sweat, unable to understand what it was. And Yefreitor Misha Sokolov, the youngest, remained forever at the bottom of the Volchya River. His body was never recovered. His mother received a death notice that read, "Missing in action while performing a combat mission." Until her death, she waited for him, hoping he was a prisoner or with the partisans. She never found out that her son had performed a heroic act, but had died not from an enemy bullet, but from the monstrous pressure that had helped his comrades to escape. His grave was a sunken T-34 tank. The official history of the war is a chronicle of great battles, army movements, and the decisions of generals. There's no place in it for stories like that of Lieutenant Orlov's crew. It is too incredible, too inconvenient, too terrifying in its absurdity. The documents regarding the loss of T-34 tank with hull number 217 were lost in the archives. Orlov's and Belov's reports were filed in their personal records with the note, "Post-traumatic stress." The system erased their feat like erasing a misspelled word. They survived hell, but lost in the clash with a soulless bureaucratic machine. Their brotherhood, forged at the bottom of the river, was shattered. Their heroic deed was buried alive. But what official history erases, folk memory often preserves. A memory that lives not in archives, but in soldiers' smoke breaks, in quiet conversations around a campfire, in the whispers of veterans. The story of Orlov's crew, though in a distorted form, did not disappear without a trace. It became a legend, one of the many soldiers' tales with which the RZHEV Meatgrinder was so rich. Among the soldiers who fought in those swamps, there was a belief about a ghost tank. It was said that occasionally on foggy nights, a T-34 tank would rise from the depths of the Volchya River. It would drive silently onto the bank, its armor covered in slime and weeds, and from its open hatch, the empty eye sockets of a dead crew would stare out. It would drive over the old battlefields as if looking for someone, and then just as silently, disappear back under the water. The soldiers believed that these were the souls of tankers who had not been properly buried and could not find peace. They were afraid to encounter this tank. It was believed that whoever saw it would soon die. This grim legend was, of course, far from reality. But at its core lay the truth of the incredible survival and tragic fate of 4 tankers. This was their monument, not made by human hands, but created from fear, superstition, and respect for an unknown feat. This story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a parable about how, In inhuman conditions, intellect and the will to live can conquer the blind forces of nature. About how the most fearsome weapon is not a cannon or a shell, but the human mind. About the terrible price that sometimes must be paid for survival, and about how true heroes often remain nameless, and their feats turn into legends that are passed down in whispers. They receive no medals or ranks. Their names are not carved on granite monuments, but their story, the story of 3 days on the edge between life and death at the bottom of an icy river, lived on. As a quiet reminder that the most terrible battles of the Second World War took place not on the battlefields, but in the souls of ordinary people, locked in hell, and forced to fight for the right to take one more breath.